I mean, if you want to understand how bad the crime problem's become in Britain, British people used to deal with crime by moving the criminals to Australia. Now British people deal with crime by moving to Australia.
Hey, g'day, and welcome to another episode of The Other Side Unplugged, our cheap and cheerful, no-frills, down and dirty news show that we drop whenever we have an interview to share or something to say. Not quite as fancily produced as our main show, our main fortnightly show that comes out every second Friday night. But in this fortnight's episode of our main show, which dropped last Friday night, you'll remember that I covered the ARC conference, and we were over in London, and we brought to you some interviews and some clips from some of the better presentations from the ARC conference. There's a little more I want to show you from the conference. There are 3 other really great presentations that I think we need to talk about. And so I thought I'd put together this special episode of Unplugged to enable us to do that today. I wanted to bring you, in particular, the speech by Konstantin Kisin. He's a much-loved Soviet Union-born British comedian and political commentator, and he's co-host of the very popular, hugely popular podcast online, the Trigonometry Show. And his warnings about the illiberalism of woke ideology, the tyranny of identity politics that we've all been living under, are very, very well known to his fans. His opening speech at the first ARC conference a year or so ago absolutely went viral all over the internet, and he was back for more serious comedy this year.
I love this country, and I say so publicly, which is how you know I still haven't integrated into British culture. Last time we were here, you might remember I opened my speech with this quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I bring it up because it's still true.
Just want to stop it there for a moment and really ponder and show you that quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that Konstantin Kisin shared with the crowd there. Now, Solzhenitsyn died in 2008 at the age of 90. He had won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, and his non-fiction classic called The Gulag Archipelago is a book that's often quoted by Jordan Peterson as one of the biggest influences on him and his life. It was described as a head-on challenge to the Soviet state, and it sold tens of millions of copies all around the world. Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet and Russian dissident and author, and he really did help to raise global awareness of the political repression in the Soviet Union, especially in the terrible Gulag prison system. So let's have a look at that quote together now. The strength or weakness of a society depends more on the level of its spiritual life than on its level of industrialization. Neither a market economy nor even general abundance constitutes the crowning achievement of human life. If a nation's spiritual energies have been exhausted, it will not be saved from collapse by the most perfect government structure or by any industrial development. A tree with a rotten core cannot stand.
As one of my many critics after my speech claimed that in quoting Solzhenitsyn in this way, I was comparing myself to him. Now, this is, of course, ridiculous. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent years in a hard labor camp where he endured a starvation diet, brutal punishments, and a complete deprivation of his liberty. I went to a British boarding school. That's where the similarities end.
Kisin went on to say that the tide is turning globally against woke, being led by the United States.
DEI, a system of anti-meritocratic discrimination, is being dismantled, not just in the American government, but much more importantly for us here, in the global corporate world as well. Once again, we can dream that our children will be judged on the content of the character and not the color of the square they post on Instagram. Government profligacy and corruption is being exposed on an industrial scale. Those may not be perfect, but according to one report, USAID gave $3 million to a rapper in Gaza who makes anti-Semitic songs. Now, whatever your politics, we can all agree that's a waste of taxpayers' money. Kanye West would have done it for free.
Konstantin says that because of the end of heavy censorship on Twitter, X, since it was taken over by Elon Musk, that we can now express a diversity of views and opinions, and it's forcing other social media companies to follow suit, companies like Meta. We've seen Mark Zuckerberg, for example, suddenly seeming to care so much about the only diversity that truly matters, the diversity of opinion and ideas.
Now, it's true, we haven't yet won the argument on freedom of speech here in Europe. I thought the most hilarious example of this was last week, when J.D. Vance gave a speech in Munich in which he criticized European leaders for trying to shut down speech that they don't like. The reaction? A German politician stood up and went, "This is unacceptable!"
Konstantin says that while there have been a lot of positive shifts in the past year or so away from woke, there have been a few negatives in our societies in the West as well, like the rising rates of crime, particularly in the United Kingdom.
British people used to deal with crime by moving the criminals to Australia. Now British people deal with crime by moving to Australia. The number of testicular injuries in women's sports is through the roof. I don't think this is a laughing matter. We can all agree women's safety is incredibly important, which is why we must do a much better job of protecting their balls. See, it's jokes like that that get me accused of being a conservative. And I hate it when people call me a conservative, because I have made many mistakes over the last 14 years, but even I haven't let in hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. And look, I know it's hard to say anything about that issue without being put in the bigger box. So let me just say, I empathize with and totally understand the motivations of the people who come here across the English Channel on smoke boats. I wouldn't want to stay in France either. See, I lied. I have integrated into British culture. But look, I also hate it when people call me a conservative, because it shows that they're missing my point. I don't believe that Western values and the societies they created are great because of an ideology or because of party affiliation. I believe our values and our societies are great because I've got eyes. When I look at the fact that millions of people risk their lives to come here every year and no one is going the other way, that tells a story, doesn't it? I know there's a lot of frustration with the state of this country and much of the Western world, but let's keep things in perspective. Of all the things that human beings have invented over the last 200 years, our culture and its values are responsible for most of them. I'm not saying we have a monopoly on genius. There are exceptions, like COVID. That was invented in China. Oh, it's controversial. Look, I know it's a controversial joke. In my defense, it's not a joke. COVID was clearly a Chinese virus. Hardworking, made on the cheap, and very good at multiplying. One of the simplest things that most people no longer understand is that we don't lead the world on innovation because we're richer. We are richer because we lead the world on innovation.
Konstantin Kisin says all of this is at risk because of the danger of us forgetting how we actually got here. That the success of Western civilization has to do with the efforts of our grandparents and their grandparents. But the current state of young people and others in our societies today, he says, is a bit like the impotent king character from The Lord of the Rings.
It's King Theoden from Lord of the Rings who sits on his throne, paralyzed. Bound to his seat by lethargy and passivity, he's kept there by a weaselly servant called Grima Wormtongue, who whispers dispiriting, cowardly lies in his ear. Too many people on our screens, our newspapers, in our schools and colleges have been modern-day Grima Wormtongues, who pour their cowardly lies in our ears and those of our children. If Grima was alive today, he'd have his own column in The Guardian. We need to admit something very unpleasant. We have been lied to. For decades, people went on TV and told you that your history is all bad and your country is plagued by prejudice and intolerance. I have debated these people many times, and I always ask them the same question. If you're a woman or an ethnic minority or someone who was spirit, gender, or whatever, where would you rather live than the West? And none of them ever answer, because we all know the answer. We are being accused of performing terribly on the very things we lead the world in. A healthy sense of your own self-worth, a self-confidence. These are not conservative values or liberal values. Those are the values of every successful group of people in history. Decline is a choice. And the good news is this: most people don't want managed decline. Most people don't want to be browbeaten and chastised for their history. Most people do not want their children to be poorer than them. And recent election results around the world bear that out. Like him or loathe him, the reason millions of people admire Elon Musk is not his charismatic speeches, stunning good looks, and ill-advised hand gestures. They admire him because he builds big things, and in doing so reminds us that we are meant to reach for the stars. A big part of the reason we are here, 4,000 of us, is that an obscure Canadian clinical psychologist became such a unique cultural phenomenon that he can help to pull us together like this. And how did Jordan Peterson get so big? How did he get so big? He reminded us of something that human beings have known for millennia, that if you adopt the attitude that honesty is better than lies, that responsibility is better than blame, and that strength is better than weakness, your life will get better.
That's Konstantin Kisin speaking at the ARC conference in London last week. He says one of the main arguments that we've got to win is the battle against anti-humanism. That because of a book written in 1968 by an academic by the name of Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb, the thesis became very popular that the human population was about to outstrip food supplies, leading to mass starvation and societal collapse. All Ehrlich's ideas became so popular among academics and the bureaucrat class in the West that they still persist today, even though history has proven him to be completely wrong. Human ingenuity has actually enabled mankind to grow and to thrive, and poverty has never been lower around the world. These are actually fantastic times, but you'd never know it. The last thing that we need right now is any centrally managed global mass movement to save humanity because of some disproven academic theory based on a very narrow and limited idea of what humanity actually is and why it is. But the simplistic and foolish ideas of Paul Ehrlich live on today in the climate alarmism and the net zero agenda.
At the core of the net zero agenda is a fundamental sense that human beings are a pestilence on the planet. That if only we could stop them reproducing and encourage them to die out peacefully, the planet would finally be safe. This has become so ingrained that many people now say they will not have children because of climate concerns. We must never get used to this because it represents a grotesque moral inversion. The birth of a child is a universally celebrated thing. And at a cultural level, any successful civilization would see more of itself being created as an unalloyed good. What do you imagine happens to civilizations that don't? So we must say, without apology, the solution to climate change can't be poverty.
He's sadly right. Britain right now is in the grip of skyrocketing energy prices that are actually killing people. Old people who can't afford to even heat their homes in winter. And this is an abomination that's happening in the wealthy Western world. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, just like our ABC and Canada's CBC, runs story after story about how the battlers are struggling to cope and how tough it is meeting the energy bills today. And it is. Those stories are real and true and they need to be covered. But they don't get to the reason for this. They pretend that it's all about something like the Ukraine war and gas shortages. It's actually about the appalling energy mismanagement by utterly useless, ideologically driven bureaucrats who are running our governments. It's about the lunatic ideologies that are being peddled by media organisations like the BBC and the ABC, that humans are bad, that industry is bad, that capitalism is bad, that innovation and free market economics is bad. All that neo-Marxist nonsense that's spewed at our kids constantly through their education and on social media and the mainstream media, that is what is actually killing poor people. And it's not just poor people in poor countries who can't afford to find the energy to, cook a meal to feed their families. It's people in our own developed nations. It's absolutely obscene. And these petty bureaucrats, they seem to ignore, mysteriously, the incredible good, the amazing good that's come from free market liberalism and that Western civilization has achieved in recent decades particularly. You've only got to consider one statistic, and that's infant mortality. Infant mortality alone, to see how far we have come because of industrialization and Western civilization. 40% of us would not be alive today if we had been born before the Industrial Revolution.
Before the Industrial Revolution, nearly 40% of children died before they hit puberty. That means 2 of the 5 people next to you would be dead right now. Now, there are a lot of people outside this room who'd be happy about that. My point is, the promise of that better tomorrow is not just a nice thing to have. It's the debt we owe our children. We have to make energy cleaner, yes, but we also have to make it as cheap and abundant as possible. And once we in Europe win that argument, we will finally have the one thing that's been missing: an economic vision that can inspire people to believe that the future will be better than the past. Now look, they asked me to say something uplifting and motivational. I'm Russian, Ukrainian, British, and a little bit Jewish. Those are not 4 groups of people that are known for their optimism and joie de vivre.
And that was Konstantin Kisin speaking at ARC. You can watch his whole speech on the ARC channel on YouTube. And we'll be back with more The Other Side Unplugged in just a moment. I've got some more speeches to share with you that are equally as fantastic as Konstantin, so do not go away. We'll be back right after this important break. The Other Side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside. Welcome back. We are looking back at some of the best bits from the ARC conference last week in London that we weren't able to fit into this fortnight's main episode of The Other Side, which, if you haven't seen it yet, is episode 403, and you can catch it on our YouTube channel, main show channel. Konstantin Kisin was not the only speaker that was concerned at ARC about inflation and poverty. Inflation and poverty are the big worries of the world at the moment, and it was touched on by many, many speakers. Those problems are caused by high energy costs because the cost of energy affects the cost of everything. Net zero has turned out to be, just as every conservative and free market liberal on the planet was warning while they were being shouted down by the brats on the left, it is actually now starting to kill people. It's kind of funny that the bureaucrat control left, as I like to call them, chose a teenage girl as their global figurehead on climate change. Remember her? The one that throws tantrums and screams, "How dare you!" at rooms full of people that are much older and more experienced and wiser than her, that she might want to pause and have some respect for instead of shouting at. Because the bureaucrat class themselves are a lot like ignorant, self-righteous, spoilt teenage girls. And if the grown-ups in the room don't take back control from these adult children that are running our governments and that sit in positions of power, we are going to be in even more serious trouble before you know it. Anyway, the popular climate scientist and author, speaker, and the president of the Copenhagen Consensus think tank, BJORN LOMBORG, was given a very clear message by the ARC organisers for his speech this year at ARC. He was told to tell us how we get growth back. Lomborg says to achieve that, we have to stop making bad climate policies and we have to stop with the climate doomism.
We have this idea that we can get by with less energy, but actually this is not what we see. If you take the amount of energy that countries have out this axis and how rich they are, it's very clear that you have India here, you have China here, you have the US up here. It's just simply very, very clear. The more energy you have, the more likely it is that you're going to be rich. Or to put it differently, to get rich, you need lots of energy, and to stay rich, you need lots of energy. There's just simply no low energy, high income countries. That means we need to get a lot more energy, not less energy. But one of the problems with climate policies is they drive up our prices, and often dramatically so, which means it's much harder to keep using energy.
British people now pay 3 times what they used to pay in real terms for their electricity than 30 years ago. The US doesn't pay more because they've maintained their access to cheap energy despite climate policies.
It needn't have been this, that the UK is now spending about 2% more of its GDP every year on electricity. That's a huge cost and an unnecessary cost. And of course, this drives down consumption. The UK actually uses less and less electricity per person since the early 2000s. Not surprisingly, if you have to pay a lot of money for electricity, you stop using it. Actually, China has gone past per person the UK. The world is just about to do that for the UK. And of course, the US just uses way more electricity. Why? Because you have cheap electricity. The UK has incredibly costly electricity. And crucially, and that's of course what we're talking about, it drives down growth. If you look at the growth rate in rich countries, the OECD, we used to have growth at about 4% per person in the 1960s. In the 1990s, we were down to about 2%. Now it's barely above 1%. Not all of this is because of climate policy, but certainly part of it towards the end is driven by climate policy. And so again, if we start getting this better, how do we get growth back? We need abundant and cheap energy. We know this. This is how you drive better and higher growth. That means we need to address the climate concern. There's a real climate problem, but there's also a lot of people incredibly worried about climate, and those are real too. We need to address this. This is how we do it. First of all, we need to tell people, yes, climate change is a real problem. It's not the end of the world. We need to tell them and show them that the current climate policies are not working. Then we need to fix this with innovation, fix it with adaptation, and fix it, surprisingly, with economic growth.
Lomborg says that the data on climate change shows that, yes, it is a problem, but it is not the doomsday disaster. It is not the end of the world that we're told it is.
Let's take a look at how many people die from climate-related disasters, floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires. 150 years ago, we estimate that about 5 million people died from these climate-related disasters. In the 1870s, 5 million people died each and every year. This is an unfathomably large number of people dying. In the 1920s, about 500,000 people died from climate-related disasters each and every year. In the 1970s, half a century later, about 55,000 people died. And today, less than 10,000 people die each and every year. Climate change is not this all-encompassing fear that's going to drive us all to death. It's not the existential problem we're talking about. We've seen a decline of 500 times. And of course, at the same time, global population has more than quintupled. We've seen a dramatic decline in the risk of dying from climate-related disasters.
Wow. Nice how we've been terrifying our children unnecessarily for 20 or 30 years, isn't it? No wonder anxiety rates are through the roof in our culture. Scumbags have been overplaying the climate risk narrative to get more power for themselves and more money for themselves, literally terrifying our children that the world's going to end. Bravo, you great moral crusaders, you. Aren't you so virtuous? I'm getting that feeling I get about the teals whenever I think of them. Lomborg's second inconvenient truth for the climate alarmist crowd is aimed squarely at the smug Climate 200 teal types, those motivated by the riches that await them by taking money from taxpayers and shoving it into solar and wind power projects. The Simon Holmes Accord Climate 200 fundraising body funneled around $700,000 into almost every teal candidate's election campaign at the last Australian federal election. $700,000, about 3 times what most parties spend on an election in one electorate. So, no financial motivation to tell a doomsday story and plant wind and solar as the great saviours there, eh? No, not at all. The world's going to end, but we can't have nuclear power. No, we can't have nuclear power. That'd be terrible. Think about this if you're planning to be so stupid as to vote for the Teals a second time at this coming federal election.
Solar and wind is not cheap when you need electricity 24/7. How do we show that? Well, take a look at this graph. We have the percent of solar and wind and electricity out the x-axis, so how much solar and wind are you producing out of your total consumption? And up this axis, you get the price. You would imagine, if you believe the green rhetoric, that as you get more and more solar and wind, this cheap energy forms, you'd get cheaper and cheaper energy. You'd also be incredibly wrong. We have data for almost 70 countries. This is what it shows. Very, very clearly, that the more solar and wind you get, the more costly it gets. So you have China and India down here with little solar and wind and very low prices. You have US with a little more solar and wind and higher prices. You have the EU up there with much more solar and wind and much higher prices. And then of course you have those front runners, the United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, that have huge amounts of solar and wind and enormously high prices. And I'm sorry to say my native Denmark does the very best or very worst, right? It has the most solar and wind and the very highest prices. It is just not true when you look at actual data that solar and wind is cheaper and cheaper. It makes electricity more and more expensive. So we gotta recognize this is a green fantasy. There's no countries down here when people tell you that more and more solar means cheaper and cheaper. They're just simply talking against the evidence.
Net zero is costing the world a fortune. It's estimated to cost the planet $27 trillion, that's million dollars in the 21st century. Not in the 21st century total, every single year. $27 trillion every single year. That's like giving every single Australian $1 million every year. It's insanity. How many starving kids could be fed around the world and hospitals could be built for that money? No wonder Donald Trump is trying to force the Europeans to start spending more on defense and getting their energy needs sorted out if they're capable of promoting such a wasteful policy as net zero so hysterically and irrationally. BJORN Lomborg says the EU's share of that 27 trillion is actually 3.3 trillion a year. That's more than the cost of all core government services every single year in the EU. Let that sink in.
Just to give you a sense of proportion, the EU right now spends about 0.8 trillion euros on education. That's anything from kindergarten to universities. It spends 1.26 trillion on health. It spends 0.13 trillion on environment, 0.22 trillion on defense, and another 0.22 trillion on police, law, courts, and prisons. All of this is 2.6 trillion euros. We're proposing on green to spend much more, 3.3 trillion euros each and every year. This is both implausible, it'll drive us bankrupt, or at least close to, and it's not going to happen. The last bit I just want to talk about is how everybody tells us we're all going to go off fossil fuels. You're being told that fossil fuels is left in the past. We need to get on the renewables train. The train is leaving the station and we all need to get on board before it's done. There is no train, there's no station, there's not even a snack bar. This is not happening. If you look at the actual data, from 1971 till today, yes, it has gone down slightly from 87% to 81%. But it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that we're going to go to zero in 2050. Not going to happen. What is likely to happen is a slow decline. If we take the fastest decline, it'll probably be done in, I don't know, 4 centuries. More likely, will be done in 9 centuries.
Now, one of the most important messages for Australians from BJORN Lomborg's speech at ARC, I think, was his insight around bushfires. We seem to have adopted a false belief in the Western world that bushfires and natural disasters are increasing because of climate change. Most Australians would probably say that's true because of the horror of the 2019 bushfires that we saw in the south of the country and all the things that they've been told by the media and at school. But it just isn't true.
We're constantly told that there's more and more fire in the world. No, there's not. We have very good data that shows we've actually seen a declining amount or fraction of the world burning each year. We've gone from about 4.2 down to about 3%. And since the late 1990s, we've had satellites circling the world every single 24/7, picking up on all fires. And what they show, very different from what you hear, is a decline of 25% or more. It's not such that the world is burning more and more. It's burning less and less. The biggest or the lowest burn was in 2022. The second lowest burn was in 2024. We need to tell people this. Of course, why? This is because people don't like fire, and so they actually make sure that there's less fire. This is not rocket science. We know how to do this. We do this all the time with adaptation.
Lomborg says that we need sensible climate policies that recognise that climate change is a problem, but one that can be managed with technology and with innovation. Cheaper green energy like 4th generation nuclear power, among other things. Getting energy costs down by 30% and focusing back on abundant energy and growth. We can stop the impoverishment and the decline. I've got one last presentation that I want to share with you from the ARC conference in London last week that we didn't have time to put in our main show, The Other Side, and I'm going to pop it in this episode of The Other Side Unplugged. It's the excellent address on classical liberalism from Ayaan Hirsi Ali. It's fantastic stuff, and we'll be back with that right after this short break.
The Other Side with Damian is Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed and diving deep on the issues that matter most in around an hour, with a new episode dropping every second Friday. As we enter our 5th year, we're going to be bringing you more content via our YouTube and X channels at Other Side Oz with The Other Side Unplugged. Damian will drop comments on the news whenever something important happens, and in-depth interviews with people who have real insight and value to add. More content when it matters, but only when it matters, so you don't miss a thing. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel at Other Side Oz by clicking the button and the bell below the picture frame, and follow us on X now at Other Side Oz. That's AUS at Other Side Oz. It's free. This is The Other Side.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a Somali-born Dutch-American writer, activist, and conservative thinker and former politician, best known as a major critic of Islam and an advocate for the rights of Muslim women. In her early 30s, she renounced the Islamic faith of her upbringing. She began identifying as an atheist and became involved in Dutch centre-right politics, eventually winding up getting elected to Parliament. Her criticism of Islam and her work on a film saw her receive death threats that meant that she had to go into hiding. And her Dutch co-filmmaker, Theo van Gogh, was murdered. In 2005, Time magazine named Ayaan Hirsi Ali as one of its 100 most influential people in the world. She now lives in the United States with her Scottish-American husband, Neil Ferguson, the well-known historian. She was one of the new atheist crowd with Christopher Hitchens and people like that. And it was Christopher Hitchens, the late great thinker and atheist, who once described Ali as the most important public intellectual to come out of Africa ever. A little over a year ago, Ayaan Hirsi Ali announced her conversion to Christianity, and her speech at ARC this year focused on the question of whether the West is inseparable from Christian values. Quite a topic for a former prominent new atheist. She started her speech by considering liberalism. That's true classical liberalism, the centre-right kind, not the liberalism in the American left-wing sense of the word. She says ARC is the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, but citizenship itself implies an entity for us to be citizens of.
Citizenship implies a distinct political entity. For most of the modern era, that entity was called the nation-state. Modern liberals trashed the nation-state and nationalism, invoking Hitler and Mussolini, and arguing that nationalism had caused World War II, not to mention the Holocaust. They failed to make a distinction between bad nationalism and good nationalism.
Ali made a clear distinction between the old classical liberals of the mid-19th century and the modern liberalism of today.
The old liberals of the 19th century had passionately believed in the nation-state and saw it as indispensable for responsible citizenship. The modern liberals disagreed. Many were not liberals at all, in the sense that John Stuart Mill would have understood them. Some were really social democrats, well to the left of true liberalism. Some were tenured intellectuals who transformed the modern university into a place for brainwashing young minds into hating their national identity and history. Some were the editors in charge of legacy media whose focus in the past 50 years seems to have been to undermine the national institutions. Some worked as activists within the web of think tanks and NGOs. And finally, some ran the administrative state, the bloated bureaucracy that has come to see itself as the benign guardian against fascism while routinely suppressing liberty.
E-Safety Commission, anyone? So what do these more left-wing liberals actually want to replace the nation-state with? Ayaan has an idea or two about exactly what they want to replace it with.
The radical pursuit of heterogeneity in the name of multiculturalism and diversity, international and supranational entities designed to transcend or sidestep the nation-state, such as the United Nations or the European Union. Some even dreamt of world government, the globalists. There were other alternatives to the nation-state too. For example, Islamists argued and continue to do so that the caliphate should be restored and Sharia law imposed. But these visions of a post-national world are delusional. The international and supranational bodies turned out to be dysfunctional, tyrannical rule of bureaucracy, and wasteful, chronically prone to fraud and abuse. The experiment, based on the bogus theory of multiculturalism, run to bring about heterogeneous societies in Europe, has in large measure failed. As for the Islamist states, as we've seen, all the territories snatched and governed by jihadi insurgents are ghastly hellscapes.
Well, she certainly pulls no punches. I guess when you've lived the horror, you don't mince words. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali has written extensively about how she herself was a victim of female genital mutilation at the age of 5, supported on religious grounds by her grandmother, but opposed by her father. Only her father couldn't do anything about it because he was locked up at the time by a communist government. She says it's time for us in the Free West to stop the post-national experiment and get back to the nation state. She says the experiment has already gone too far and we need to get back to sensible nationalism and sensible levels of immigration to match, something that's already happening in her home country of the United States.
The good news is that the proponents of a post-national global order are cast out into the political wilderness in America. The Democratic Party today cannot adopt the let's sit this one out until 2028 and everything will be okay posture of 2016. They have, number one, no clear leadership to help the party navigate its way out of the mess they have put themselves in. All the clever Democrats are now serving in or supporting the Trump administration. Number two, they have no funding. The big donors have moved on, especially after Kamala Harris's profligate campaign. Number three, they have no media monopoly. And it's not only X, formerly Twitter. There is a forest of new media, and most of that is right of center and beyond. Number four, they have no control of government, especially through the bureaucracy and intelligence communities. In fact, all DEI hires are being actively doged from various agencies.
Ah, yes, every Western nation needs a good doging right now, especially us right here in Australia.
Most important of all, their globalist message was rejected in favor of the America First agenda. In short, they have no power. And that is good news. It means Americans have a better chance of achieving the mission of this conference, which is to restore responsible citizenship. For me, responsible citizenship means the restoration of a healthy nationalism. That's the preeminence of national sovereignty, loyalty to a shared national identity, and citizenship defined as allegiance to the nation-state. It's fidelity to the Constitution or to the foundational principles and mythos of the nation, to the idea that all citizens are equal before the law, that we all have the same rights and obligations, that justice is blind, that we are all innocent of any crime until proven guilty, that the government is limited and constrained by law, and it's there to protect these things.
Wow, I just want to play that last minute of her speech over and over and over. So what about the original theme of the speech, the question of whether the West can be in any way separated from Christianity? You don't have to be a Christian to agree with everything that Ali has said up until now, and you don't even need to be a Christian to accept that Christian ideas do underpin the centuries-old evolution of Western civilization and liberal thinking.
In Europe, Christianity remains, despite decades of secularization, the crucial operating system of society. Without it, the apps don't work. When I came to Europe in 1992, fleeing a forced marriage that was part of a failed clan system, this was the type of nation-state that I found. Wealthy, peaceful, stable, and optimistic, but still rooted in the Calvinist and Catholic traditions. I had left the chaos of Somalia and other African nations where I had lived, where tribal, ethnic, and religious conflict had made it impossible to develop a healthy nationalism. What I found in Holland was truly inspiring to me. I found the same inspiration when I first went to the United States. But in the past 16 or so years, I have seen on both sides of the Atlantic a sustained effort to drive Christianity to the margins of our society. I believe this gamble on secularism will go terribly wrong. It already has.
Ali says that every successful nation has to be based on more than just a constitution and a body of law, that there must be some kind of transcendental stories that unite citizens to an ethical as well as a legal code.
For the West, that was the Judeo-Christian story of the Bible. The biblical understanding of human sinfulness inspired the concept of limited state power or rule of law, emphasizing checks and balances to prevent tyranny, Isaiah 33:22. Governments are seen as instruments to maintain order and justice, but not as ultimate authorities. The belief that all humans are created in God's image, Genesis 1:27, underpins ideas of equal worth, human rights, and dignity for all individuals, including the poor and the neglected. Biblical teachings such as love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, emphasizes care for others and fairness in governance. The Bible's distinction between God's sovereignty and earthly authority, Matthew 22:21, influenced the Western principle that the state should not overreach into matters of faith and conscience.
The state should not overreach into matters of faith and conscience. Wow, what a novel idea for the modern West's massive bureaucratic, technocratic states like Australia. Biblical principles clearly put the state as subordinate to a higher power and more eternal moral and ethical codes, requiring leaders not to exploit their people. We toss out the operating system, says Ali, and the app simply won't run as it's supposed to.
Biblical ethics stress that rulers and citizens are accountable to a higher moral law, ensuring that government acts justly and protects the vulnerable. These principles collectively shaped Western values like democracy, human rights, and constitutional government. Responsible citizenship in the West is inseparable from Christian morality. Please, let's aspire to build or restore the nation-states on which our security depends. And let's ensure that they run as they used to on that Christian operating system without which we can have no moral compass. Thank you.
Now, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's old friends like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris would argue precisely that point, that we don't need Christianity to provide our moral compass, that morality can come from elsewhere. What do you think? Can secularism survive? Or do we need to ditch it and the moral relativism that says all religions are equal? Do we say that our countries are built upon the Old Testament of Judeo-Christian belief and the New Testament of Christian belief, and that you have to at least respect those core values to be a responsible citizen in the West? Let us know your thoughts by leaving your comments below. We don't turn off the comments like the ABC does, disgracefully, considering that they're taxpayer funded. But anyway, that's another story. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and do head over to the other. It really does help. I mean, I say it all the time, and you probably think, oh yeah, like and subscribe, like and subscribe. I'm always saying that on YouTube, but actually do it. Actually go down and press that like, that subscribe button, and that little notification bell beside it, because that's how you get alerted to when we're posting new content. And because we're doing the other side Unplugged now, and it's not regular, it comes out whenever, those alerts are going to be more and more important. Our regular show, The Other Side, is fortnightly now, every second Friday. The next episode is episode 404. It'll be out next Friday night, March the 7th. Can you believe it's March already? March the 7th, and I'll look forward to seeing you then in our fancier studio. Bye for now. The Other Side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside.
The Other Side with Damian is Australia's best independent news commentary show. As we enter our 5th year, we're going to be bringing you more content via our YouTube and X channels at Other Side Oz with The Other Side Unplugged. More content when it matters, but only when it matters, so you don't miss a thing. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel at Other Side Oz by clicking the button and the bell below the picture frame. And follow us on X now at Other Side Oz. That's AUS at Other Side Oz. It's free. This is The Other Side. Stay in touch. Check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month.